There is a house on a ridge above Rotherham that nobody knows about, and if you arrive there in late afternoon, driving up a narrow lane past a farm and a Norman church and a row of cottages built for colliers 200 years ago, you will round a corner and see something that should not exist in South Yorkshire, and should not exist anywhere in Europe, and should certainly not be standing here in open countryside 10 miles from Sheffield in a landscape of former coal pits and reclaimed spoil heaps. Wentworth Woodhouse rises in front of you like a hallucination, a Palladian facade the length of 2 football pitches in pale grey sandstone at the end of a parkland lawn that has been mown for 300 years. It is the largest country house in Britain. It is almost certainly the longest private facade in Europe, and until 2017, the National Trust had never been allowed to buy it. Wentworth Woodhouse is not one house, it is 2, back to back, facing in opposite directions. The Baroque west front was built first, in brick, between 1724 and 1728. The Palladian east front was built second, in stone, between 1734 and 1750, on the other side of the same roof, because the man who built the first front had decided, less than 6 years after it was finished, that it embarrassed him. He wanted something grander. He commissioned an entirely new house to be grafted onto the back of the one he already had. The combined facade runs 606 feet. The roofs cover 2.5 acres. The house has approximately 300 rooms, once claimed to be 365, one for every day of the year. And for most of the 20th century, it stood half derelict, owned in sequence by a cash-strapped Earl, a teacher training college, a bankrupt entrepreneur, an architect who died in his 90s, and a preservation trust that is still raising money to save it. They walk the state rooms. They photograph the marble saloon with its ceiling 60 feet above the floor. They pause on the long lawn and look east across a park that once ran to the horizon. They buy coffee in the Stable Block Cafe, and almost none of them ask the question that the 2 warring facades of Wentworth Woodhouse seem to insist upon. Why is this place not famous? Not a ruin, not a palace of the crown, not a house of a vanished family. Wentworth Woodhouse is Britain's largest private residence, the political seat of a prime minister, the childhood home of an earl whose legitimacy was publicly contested in the House of Lords, the subject of one of the most vindictive acts of government sabotage in 20th century English history, and the location of a love affair that ended in a French mountainside in May 1948, with 2 bodies in a wrecked aircraft and a transatlantic scandal that the Kennedy family has spent 3 generations trying to manage. And unless you are from South Yorkshire, or unless your grandfather worked the Elsecar pit, or unless you have read a particular small shelf of 20th century biographies, you have very probably never heard of it. Wentworth Woodhouse is one of the most spectacular houses in Britain. It has been the seat of one of the 5 richest Whig families in Georgian England. It has welcomed kings and prime ministers and American millionaires and a future queen of the United Kingdom. It is also one of the most quietly punished houses in Britain, because behind the stone and the Palladian symmetry and the 84 acres of surviving parkland lies a history of concealment and deliberate damage, of heirs hidden, of legitimacy contested, of a landscape dug up by government order in 1947 for coal that did not need to be extracted where it was extracted, of a family whose last earls preferred Ireland, the Riviera, or the grave, to the house their ancestors had built in pursuit of the title they had almost been given and had never quite won. Wentworth Woodhouse is where the English aristocracy went to be humiliated. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with 2 cousins and a disputed name. In the first decade of the 18th century, in the southern reaches of the West Riding of Yorkshire, 2 members of the Wentworth family were living roughly 4 miles apart and very quietly despising each other. They were first cousins. They shared a surname. They shared a claim, more or less equally good, to the earldom of Strafford, which had been held by their grandfather, Thomas Wentworth, the great royalist minister executed by Parliament in 1641. And they could not stand the sight of each other. The elder of the two was Thomas Wentworth, who in 1711 was created the first Earl of Strafford of the second creation, and who built a country house he called Wentworth Castle at Stainborough, on a ridge above Barnsley with views west across the Pennine. His house was intended to re-establish the dynastic seat of the Strafford line. It was the finer of the two. It was certainly the older claim. The younger of the two was Thomas Watson-Wentworth, who had inherited a smaller estate and a much larger fortune from his maternal uncle William Wentworth, second Earl of Strafford of the first creation, and who had been specifically passed over for the earldom when it was recreated for his cousin. He was rich. He was furious, and at his inheritance in 1723 he did what ambitious men of his era did when they had been insulted by the crown. He built. He built 3.5 miles east of his cousin's house, on the ridge of Wentworth Park, on the site of a much older Jacobean hall that his uncle had owned. He commissioned the fashionable Baroque architect Ralph Tunnicliffe and began construction in 1724. By 1728, the new west front of Wentworth Woodhouse was substantially complete. It was built in fashionable Dutch-influenced brick, rich with carved stonework, and it was larger than Wentworth Castle. It was also a compromise. It was the kind of house a very rich man built to signal his arrival, but it was not, in the strict classical standards of early Georgian architecture, a house of the first rank. Watson-Wentworth knew it. Within 5 years of moving in, he knew it. He was in London in 1733 when he encountered, at the opening of a private gallery, a set of drawings by Henry Flitcroft, a protege of Lord Burlington and a rising disciple of the strict Palladian revival. Burlington himself, whom Watson-Wentworth had been cultivating for nearly a decade, explained to his patron that the new west front at Wentworth was already out of date. The future of serious country house architecture was Palladian. Stone, not brick. Symmetry, not Baroque flourish. Classical proportions from Vitruvius, not Northern European inventiveness from the Low Countries. Watson-Wentworth made a decision that night that has only one parallel in the history of English country house building. He decided to keep his new house and also to rebuild it. He commissioned Flitcroft to design an entirely different mansion in pale ashlar sandstone in the strictest Palladian manner, and to build it grafted onto the back of the brick one he had just completed. The two houses would share a roof in the middle. They would have one vast central block, 2 monumental colonnaded fronts, and 2 separate entry sequences. The west front would face his estate park. The east front would face the public approach from the road. No visitor arriving at Wentworth Woodhouse would ever see the old brick Baroque facade. Every visitor arriving at Wentworth Woodhouse would be received, forever afterwards, at the Palladian east front that Flitcroft was now designing. Construction on the east front began in 1734. It took 16 years. It cost an amount that Watson-Wentworth's own estate steward refused to enter into the household accounts in a single line, because he believed no one at the Treasury would believe the figure if it were ever audited. The Palladian east front was completed in 1750. It ran 606 feet. It had 19 bays, a 6-column Corinthian portico, and a skyline of Attic urn. It was the longest facade on any private house in Europe. It is still the longest facade on any private house in Europe. Thomas Watson-Wentworth was, in the meantime, made first Marquess of Rockingham in 1746. The Strafford earldom he had wanted was still held by his cousin's line at Wentworth Castle. He never got it back, but he had outbuilt them, he had outspent them. And when he died in 1750, days after the Palladian front was finally completed, he left his son, Charles Watson-Wentworth, the largest country house in Britain, and a Whig political inheritance that would very shortly, in Charles's generation, take the family to the summit of English government. The second Marquess of Rockingham was not a tall man. He was shy, stammered, had ill health for most of his short adult life, and preferred horses to the House of Commons. He also happened to be, when the opportunity presented itself in 1765, the only Whig grandee available to lead a cabinet at a moment when King George III needed a prime minister who could negotiate the American colonies off a cliff. Charles Watson-Wentworth became Prime Minister of Great Britain in July 1765 at the age of 35. He repealed the Stamp Act, the measure of taxation that had united the American colonies against London for the first time. He fell from office a year later. He returned to opposition for 16 years, during which his private secretary was a young Irish philosopher and political writer called Edmund Burke, who lived at Wentworth Woodhouse for months at a time and wrote some of his most influential speeches in the Marquess's library. In March 1782, as the American War of Independence collapsed, Rockingham was recalled to the premiership. In July 1782, 4 months after returning to office, he died suddenly at the age of 52, without legitimate children, leaving Wentworth Woodhouse and the whole Rockingham estate to his nephew. The nephew was William Wentworth Fitzwilliam, 4th Earl Fitzwilliam. The house passed into the Fitzwilliam family in 1782. It would not pass out of their hands again until 1989. For 207 years, 7 generations of Fitzwilliams owned Wentworth Woodhouse. They also owned, through the marriage settlement that had brought the Rockingham estates into the family, one of the richest coalfields in England, the Elsecar, Parkgate, and Orgreave seams that underlay the Wentworth Park were, by the 1830s, the most profitable private coal reserves in Britain. The Fitzwilliams became, in the course of the 19th century, one of the 5 richest aristocratic families in the United Kingdom. They were also lucky, for most of the century, in the manner of their inheritances. And then, in February 1902, the luck ran out. The Fitzwilliam succession of 1902 is one of the strangest legal disputes in modern English peerage history. It was a dispute that turned on a single question: on what date, in what place, and under what circumstances had a child called William Charles de Meuron Wentworth Fitzwilliam been born? William Charles, known to his family as Billy, had been born in July 1872, the son of William Henry Wentworth Fitzwilliam, Viscount Milton, the heir apparent to the 6th Earl Fitzwilliam. Billy's mother was Laura Beauclerk, a famously beautiful and indiscreet Anglo-Irish aristocrat, whose own father's lineage included 3 illegitimate Royal Stuart bastards, and a tradition of disputed parenthood that the Fitzwilliams had initially overlooked when Lord Milton had fallen in love with her in 1869. Billy's birth, however, had not taken place in England. His parents had been travelling in Canada in the spring and summer of 1872 in order, according to the family's later account, to remove Laura from the stress of London society during a difficult pregnancy. Billy had been born on the 25th of July, 1872. The place of birth was variously recorded in various documents as Pontypool, Ontario, as a Canadian Pacific Railway train between Montreal and Toronto, and as a hotel at Niagara Falls. The birth had not been registered in any Canadian provincial office in 1872. A birth certificate was only issued in 1874, by which time the family was back in England on the application of Lord Milton to a London solicitor who had obtained a Canadian affidavit from a local doctor at Pontypool, who had, it later emerged, not been present at the actual birth. None of this would have mattered if Billy had been born in circumstances that nobody had reason to question. He had not. Between 1869 and 1872, Laura Beauclerk was widely rumoured in London society to have been having an affair with her husband's first cousin, Charles Ponsonby. The affair was an open secret. Letters between Laura and Ponsonby survived and were, 20 years later, still in the possession of members of the Ponsonby family. More seriously, Laura was also rumoured to have given birth to at least one child before Billy that had not survived, and there was widespread suspicion that the 1872 Canadian trip had been undertaken specifically to obscure the circumstances of a birth that the Fitzwilliams would not have wished to have been witnessed. When the 6th Earl Fitzwilliam died in February 1902, his younger sons, Billy's uncles, refused to accept the succession. They argued, in a remarkable family meeting held at Wentworth Woodhouse in March 1902, and attended by nearly every male Fitzwilliam of adult age, that Billy's Canadian birth was irregular, that the 1874 registration was fraudulent, that the doctor who had signed the affidavit had not been present at the delivery, and that even if Billy had been born on the date claimed, there were serious grounds for believing that his biological father was Charles Ponsonby rather than Viscount Milton. They demanded an investigation. They proposed that Billy should step aside and that the succession should pass to his uncle, George Wentworth Fitzwilliam. Billy refused. He was 30 years old, married, father of 2 young children, and in possession of the Fitzwilliam seat, the Fitzwilliam coalfields, and Wentworth Woodhouse itself. He was not about to surrender any of them on the evidence of 20-year-old rumours. The dispute was referred, extraordinarily, to the Committee for Privileges of the House of Lords. For 3 years, between 1902 and 1905, the committee heard evidence. A Canadian railway porter was brought across the Atlantic to testify about the movement of the Fitzwilliam party's private railway carriage between Montreal and Toronto in July 1872. A retired English nanny, long dismissed from the household, was subpoenaed to describe the state of Laura Beauclerk's waistline in the spring of 1872. A Church of England vicar in Niagara Falls testified that no christening of a Fitzwilliam infant had been recorded in his parish register at any point between 1872 and 1880. The evidence was inconclusive. On the balance of testimony, the committee found in Billy's favour in 1905 and confirmed him as the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam. He retained Wentworth Woodhouse. But the case was never forgotten in the family. For the rest of Billy's life, he was known, in private Fitzwilliam correspondence and among his disgruntled uncles, as Canadian Billy. Billy was 7th Earl from 1902 until his death in 1943. He was, by all accounts, an affable, decent man who loved the estate and managed it carefully. He had 5 children. The eldest son, Peter, succeeded as 8th Earl in 1943. Peter Fitzwilliam, 8th Earl, is the great tragic figure of the house. Peter had been decorated for gallantry in the Special Operations Executive during the Second World War. He was handsome, charming, a gambler, a passionate horseman, and by the end of the war, a man of approximately £40 million in modern money. He was also unhappily married. His wife, Olive, had had a serious nervous breakdown in 1944. By the winter of 1947, Peter was in London, openly involved in a love affair that the English and American press were both tracking, with a young widow of 28, named Kathleen Kennedy. Kick, as the Kennedys called her, was the favourite daughter of Joseph Kennedy, the former American ambassador to the court of St. James's, and the sister of the future American president John F. Kennedy. She had married Billy Cavendish, the Marquess of Hartington and heir to the Duke of Devonshire, at Chatsworth in May 1944. 4 months later, on the 10th of September 1944, Billy Cavendish had been killed in action in Belgium. Kick was a Catholic American widow of an English Protestant Marquess, 26 years old, and rebuilding her life in London. Peter Fitzwilliam was a married Protestant English Earl with a nervous invalid wife in the process of seeking a divorce, and 15 years older than Kick. The relationship was, by every measurement of 1947 English society and 1947 Kennedy Catholic Bostonian society, impossible. They tried to marry anyway. On the 13th of May 1948, Peter and Kick boarded a chartered de Havilland Dove aircraft at Le Bourget airfield in Paris, intending to fly south to Cannes for a weekend before returning to Paris to meet Kick's father, Joe Kennedy, for lunch on the 15th of May, at which meeting they planned to inform him of their intention to marry. The aircraft flew into bad weather over the Ardèche Mountains in the south of France. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon of May 13th, 1948, the pilot lost navigational bearings in a heavy thunderstorm, descended in an attempt to locate landmarks, and flew into the ridge of the Coiron mountain at an altitude of 4,700 feet. There were no survivors. Peter Fitzwilliam was 38 years old. Kick Kennedy was 28. Their bodies were recovered from the wreckage of the aircraft on the afternoon of the 14th of May, 1948. Joe Kennedy, who had arrived in Paris for the scheduled lunch, drove south to identify his daughter. The Kennedy family buried Kick in the Cavendish plot at Edensor on the Chatsworth estate, at the personal invitation of Billy Cavendish's parents. Next to her late first husband, her family did not attend the funeral. No American Kennedy attended. Joe Kennedy paid for the headstone. The inscription, which he chose personally, read, "Joy she gave, joy she has found." Peter was buried in the Fitzwilliam family mausoleum at Wentworth. His brothers, who had not approved of the divorce and had never met Kit Kennedy, gave instructions that the memorial inscription should record only the dates of his birth, his military service, and his death. There was no reference to the aircraft, to the crash, or to the woman who had died with him. The 8th Earl's death in the Ardèche was not, however, the most serious blow Wentworth Woodhouse received in 1948. It was the second. In the spring of 1946, 18 months earlier, Manny Shinwell, the new Labour Minister of Fuel and Power, had signed an open-cast coal mining order for the Wentworth estate. Emmanuel Shinwell was the son of a Jewish immigrant tailor from the East End of London. He had grown up in the slums of Glasgow, worked from the age of 11 in the tailoring trade, joined the Independent Labour Party as a young man, and been imprisoned in 1919 for 5 months on charges of incitement to riot during the Glasgow tramway strike. He had entered Parliament as a Labour member in 1922. In August 1945, in the new Attlee Labour government, he had been appointed Minister of Fuel and Power, with responsibility for nationalising the coal industry. The 8th Earl, Peter Fitzwilliam, met Shinwell in London in April 1946 to discuss the mining proposal. The meeting, according to the account Peter gave his own estate manager afterwards, lasted less than half an hour. Shinwell, Peter said, was personally hostile to everything Wentworth Woodhouse represented. The site inspection had recommended open-cast mining in limited areas of the outer estate. Shinwell had, over the objections of his own civil servants, signed an order for mining to commence immediately, directly up to the main formal gardens, with no protective buffer for the house itself. Mining began in May 1946. Within 3 months, the Fitzwilliams' formal gardens, designed by Humphrey Repton in 1790 and maintained in continuous cultivation for 156 years, were a network of 60-foot open trenches. The ornamental lake had been drained. The Repton vistas were gone. By the end of 1947, open-cast coal extraction had moved to within 15 yards of the Palladian east front. The ground shook when the explosive charges were fired. The house sank approximately 5 feet into partially unsupported subsoil. Cracks opened in the interior walls of the staterooms. A stretch of the Humphrey Repton Park that extended almost a mile east of the house had become a landscape of piled spoil and rubble. The Fitzwilliams raised a constitutional protest. Winston Churchill, then in opposition, spoke about Wentworth in a House of Commons debate in 1948 and called it the most disgraceful act of vandalism committed by any peacetime administration in modern English history. Shinwell, questioned in the same debate, replied that coal is coal and that Britain needed it. He was technically correct. Britain was in the throes of a post-war fuel crisis. The winter of 1946 to 1947 had been one of the coldest on record. Open-cast coal was cheaper to extract than deep-mine coal. There was a defensible economic argument for Shinwell's decision. What there was no defensible argument for was the location. The Wentworth estate was not uniquely rich in accessible coal. Open-cast sites existed all over Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and the West Riding. To bring the trenches to within 15 yards of the facade of Britain's largest private house was not a necessary consequence of the national fuel emergency. It was a choice. And the choice, Peter Fitzwilliam believed and told his estate manager and told Churchill, had been made by the man who had spent his childhood in the Glasgow slums and who had gone to prison for organising the tramway strikers of 1919. The mining continued through the winters of 1947 and 1948. Peter Fitzwilliam died in the Ardèche in May 1948. His successor, his uncle Eric, 9th Earl, elderly and in poor health, did not have the will or the political capital to fight Shinwell any further. The open-cast extraction was finally halted in 1950, by which point the estate had lost approximately 98 acres of formal gardens, parkland, and Repton landscape. The Wentworth Woodhouse the Fitzwilliams had inherited was gone. What the mining had left, however, was still the largest country house in Britain, and the family still had to find a way to live in it. But the house that astonishes the visitors who still make the pilgrimage to Rotherham was not built by the Marquess, whose name is carved on its colonnade. Their presence at Wentworth is documented, recorded in ink on paper in the Fitzwilliam estate accounts, now held at the Sheffield Archives in an unbroken series from 1740 to 1979. Their stories are not. There was a head gardener called William Isleby who was paid 32 shillings a week in 1782, and whose reports to the fourth Earl Fitzwilliam survive in letters held at Sheffield. He had managed the kitchen garden for 24 years. He had designed 3 glass houses. He was sacked in 1783 for what the new estate steward described as a refusal to defer to the successor of the late Marquess. We know he moved to Harrogate. We know nothing else. There was a collier's wife at Elsecar called Mary Ogden, who appears in the Fitzwilliam Charity Register of 1826 as the recipient of a weekly pension of 2 shillings, her husband having been killed in a pit accident at the Fitzwilliam-owned colliery at Parkgate in March of that year. The pension continued for 38 years, until Mary's death in 1864, at which point she was living in a Fitzwilliam almshouse at Wath-upon-Dearne, having outlived 6 of her 7 children. Her name appears in the register 1,976 times. We do not know where she is buried. There was a butler called Thomas Reynolds, who served at Wentworth from 1911 to 1944, and who was responsible for managing the household of approximately 95 indoor servants that ran the staterooms during the 2 great house parties of 1924 and 1926. His name appears in Billy Fitzwilliam's private memoir in a list of those whose service has been indispensable. We know he married, had 3 children, and died at Wentworth in the village of Harley in 1951. His service book is among the Fitzwilliam papers. We have never seen his face. There were hundreds of other men and women. There were grooms, gamekeepers, housekeepers, footmen, laundry maids, nursery nurses, chauffeurs, pit managers, tenant farmers, bricklayers, plasterers, lamp men, and the colliers who dug the coal from under the park and brought the Fitzwilliam family their fortune. The 1881 census records more than 170 people employed directly on the Wentworth estate and another 1,500 in the Fitzwilliam collieries. Most of them are names in a ledger. Some of them are not even that. We know they were there. We know they kept the house standing and the pit working and the fortune flowing. We do not know how they saw the family they served, or how they saw the family who ruled them, or how they felt on the morning in 1946 when the first open-cast trench was cut through the Repton Gardens by a government made up, as they had understood it, of men like themselves. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. We know only that they were there, that the house they served is still standing, and that their names survived, some of them, because the Fitzwilliam Estate Office kept its accounts with the bureaucratic thoroughness of an aristocratic house that never had to worry about bankruptcy, and nobody threw the ledgers away. The Fitzwilliams built the largest private facade in Europe. Other men and women built it for them, cleaned it, lit it, fed it, and mined the coal that paid for it. The house absorbed both. Peter Fitzwilliam died in May 1948 at the age of 38. His uncle Eric, the 9th Earl, succeeded him at the age of 64. Eric was unmarried and childless. He died in 1952. His successor, the 10th Earl Tom Fitzwilliam, took over the estate at the age of 42. Tom was the last Fitzwilliam who would make Wentworth his home. By 1952, the cost of heating the house was greater than the income the surrounding estate could still generate. The open-cast mining had destroyed the park. The coal nationalisation of 1947 had ended the Fitzwilliam colliery revenues. Death duties imposed on Peter Fitzwilliam's estate in 1948, and again on Eric's in 1952, had taken more than 2/3 of the family's liquid capital. The house was, in plain financial terms, no longer affordable. Tom Fitzwilliam leased the East Wing to Lady Mabel College of Physical Education for Women in 1949. For the next 30 years, from 1949 to 1979, the principal state rooms of Britain's largest country house were used as student dormitories, gymnasiums, lecture halls, and laundry blocks. The marble saloon became an assembly hall. The long gallery became a corridor lined with student lockers. The painted ceilings looked down on ping-pong tables and boxes of hockey equipment. It was the least dignified use to which an English country house of the first rank had ever been put. It was also, perversely, the most successful tenancy Wentworth Woodhouse would have in the 20th century. The lease paid the running costs. It kept the roof watertight. The house survived. In 1979, Lady Mabel College closed. Tom Fitzwilliam died the same year. The house reverted to the 10th Earl's second wife, Joyce Fitzwilliam, who neither wanted nor could afford to live in it. For the next decade, Wentworth Woodhouse stood empty except for a pair of caretakers. In 1989, Joyce Fitzwilliam sold the house and the immediate gardens to Wensley Hayden Bailey, a pharmaceutical fortune entrepreneur who intended to restore it as a private residence. Hayden Bailey went bankrupt within a decade. In 1999, the house was sold again to Clifford Newbold, a retired architect from London, for £1.5 million. Newbold loved the house. He lived in a tiny set of private rooms and spent the next 15 years quietly restoring what he could afford, which was not enough. He died in 2015. His sons sold Wentworth Woodhouse to the newly formed Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust in 2017 for £7 million. The trust had been established specifically to buy the house. It had been granted one of the largest heritage lottery allocations in British history. It is, at the time of this recording, still working through a £42 million programme of phased restoration, room by room, roof by roof, chimney by chimney. Visitors can now walk the state rooms. The Repton Gardens are being slowly reconstructed. The facade has been made watertight. The mining scars in the outer park are still visible on aerial photographs if you know what to look for, and the ponds that Shinwell's trenches drained have not been refilled. Stand on the long lawn east of the house on a November afternoon. Stand on the long lawn east of Wentworth Woodhouse on a November afternoon with the low sun catching the 19 bays of the Palladian east front, and you see what every visitor has seen for 170 years, a silhouette of stone, a portico of 6 Corinthian columns, a facade longer than Buckingham Palace. But look closer, and the picture complicates. The house behind the stone is brick. The brick behind the stone is the earlier Baroque house that the builder decided, within 5 years of completing it, was no longer good enough. The park around you is 84 acres smaller than it was in 1945. The ornamental lake is not there. The Repton Cascades are not there. The Temple of Hercules is not there. The ground dips in places where the open cast trenches ran and has not settled properly in 80 years. The whole building is a curated memory of an aristocratic project that the 20th century systematically tried to erase and did not quite succeed. Wentworth Woodhouse is not one house. It is the record, in brick and stone, of everything the English landed aristocracy wanted to be, and everything 20th century Britain decided it would not permit them to remain. Thomas Watson-Wentworth wanted an earldom. The house gave him a marquessate. He wanted to outbuild his cousin. The house gave him the longest facade in Europe. The second Marquess wanted the premiership. The house gave him 2 premierships and his burial monument in York Minster. The 7th Earl wanted his legitimacy confirmed. The House of Lords gave it to him in 1905. The 8th Earl wanted a divorce and a second marriage to an American widow. The aircraft over the Coiron Mountain gave him neither. And the 10th Earl wanted a way to keep the house that had been given to him. The 1946 Coal Order, the open cast trenches, and the post-war tax regime gave him a physical training college and 30 years of genteel surrender. The house gave them all what they asked of it, in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house that had been built to absorb anything the centuries could throw at it. The house always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost, because what Wentworth has also always preserved in its estate books and its wage registers and its charity rolls is the names of the William Islabys and the Mary Ogdens and the Thomas Reynoldses, without whom no Earl could have lived in the building for a single day. The Fitzwilliams gave their names to the mausoleum. They gave nothing to the colliers who dug their coal. 4 generations later, the Fitzwilliams are a footnote in a Preservation Trust's annual report. The colliers are not even that. Wentworth Woodhouse asks the same question that all great houses ask, but with a sharpness that almost no other English country house quite matches. Who does a building belong to? The Whig Marquess who built the longest facade in Europe to spite a cousin 5 miles away? The Prime Minister who drafted the repeal of the Stamp Act in its library? The Earl whose legitimacy was argued in front of the House of Lords for 3 years? The Earl who flew into a French mountainside with a Kennedy? The Minister of Fuel and Power who sent open-cast trenches to within 15 yards of its walls? The 3,000 girls of Lady Mabel College who played hockey on its marble floors for 30 years? The bankrupt businessman who tried and failed to restore it? The retired London architect who bought it for cash and lived in 2 rooms of it for 15 years? The Preservation Trust still raising money to fix the roofs? Or the ridge itself, the long South Yorkshire sandstone escarpment above the Don Valley, which was here before any Wentworth had been knighted, and which will be here long after the last tour guide has gone home? Wentworth does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands, pale stone, and longer than any other private facade in Europe, on its ridge above Rotherham, and lets you decide. And somewhere on the east front, halfway up the colonnade, there is a single stone block that is ever so slightly paler than the ones beside it, because it was replaced in 1948 after a small crack opened in the masonry. During the week the open-cast trenches reached within 15 yards of the house. Nothing is carved on it. Nothing needs to be. They are still down there. They always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.